The rain fell in a soft, relentless drizzle over Seattle, casting a silver sheen across the city's glass towers and cobblestone streets. Inside the emerald hearth, a high-end restaurant perched on a downtown rooftop. The clink of wine glasses and murmurs of conversation filled the air, barely muffled by the patter against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Eleanor Voss, known to the world as Ellie Voss, CEO of Nexus Labs, sat in a sleek, custom-built wheelchair at a corner table, her posture impeccable, despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Her tailored navy blazer hugged her shoulders, and her auburn hair was swept into an elegant chignon, every detail curated to project the confidence expected of a tech titan. At 32, Ellie had built a reputation as a visionary, leading her company to dominate the biotech wearable market. But tonight, she wasn't here as a CEO. She was here as a woman, daring to hope for connection, risking the vulnerability she'd buried since the accident 6 years ago that stole her ability to walk. The dating app had promised to match Nathaniel Pierce, a hedge fund manager with a polished profile and a charming smile. Ellie had hesitated, her thumb hovering over the meet button, knowing the risk of revealing her disability. She'd left it out of her profile not out of shame, but because she wanted someone to see her first, not the chair. Now, as she sipped sparkling water, her hazel eyes scanned the room, waiting. Nathaniel arrived 10 minutes late. His tailored suit slightly damp from the rain, his blonde hair slicked back. He flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes as he slid into the seat across from her. Eleanor Voss. "Right, you look different from your pictures," he said, his gaze flicking to her wheelchair, his tone already cooling. Ellie's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Ellie, please. And you must be Nathaniel. It's nice to meet you." She extended a hand, but he didn't take it, his eyes narrowing as he leaned back, arms crossed. "You didn't mention this," he said, gesturing vaguely at her chair, his voice loud enough to draw glances from nearby tables. Ellie's fingers curled around her glass, her nails pressing into her palm. "I didn't think it defined me," she said calmly, though her heart raced. "I'm here to get to know you, not explain my medical history." Nathaniel's laugh was sharp, cutting through the hum of the restaurant. "Get to know me? Come on! You're the Ellie Voss, the tech genius, the billionaire? I thought I was meeting that woman, not—" He waved at her chair again, his voice rising. "Not someone who can't even walk to the bar. This is a joke, right?" The room seemed to freeze. Forks paused, mid-air conversations hushed, and heads turned toward the corner booth. A waiter lingered awkwardly nearby, a tray of appetizers trembling in his hands. A couple at the next table whispered behind their menus, and a phone camera glinted from across the room. Ellie felt the weight of every stare, each one a reminder of the girl she'd once been before the crash, before the headlines, before the world decided her worth lay in her title, not her heart. Her throat tightened, but she refused to flinch. "I'm still that woman," she said, her voice low but firm. "If you came expecting a fantasy, I'm not it." Nathaniel stood his chair, scraping against the hardwood floor. "You're right, you're not," he said loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "I matched with Eleanor Voss, not some charity case." The words landed like a slap, and Ellie's hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Is that really her, the CEO in a wheelchair?" And someone muttered, "Talk about a blind date disaster." Ellie's chest ached, the familiar sting of being seen as less than whole. She reached for her bag, ready to leave, to retreat to the safety of her penthouse, where no one could hurt her again. Then a voice cut through the tension, calm but unyielding. "That's enough." Every head turned toward the entrance. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, in a worn denim jacket, and scuffed work boots, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain. Caleb Monroe, a plumber who'd been grabbing a late coffee at the bar after a long shift, had overheard every word. His hazel eyes, steady and kind, locked onto Ellie, not Nathaniel, as he crossed the room with quiet purpose. The host stepped aside, stunned, as Caleb reached Ellie's table. He placed a hand gently on the back of her wheelchair, his presence a shield against the staring crowd. "Are you ready to go?" he asked softly, his voice carrying no pity, only respect. Ellie blinked, her breath catching. Was this another cruel twist? But Caleb's gaze held no mockery, no agenda, just a quiet strength that made her feel seen, not judged. She gave a small nod, her throat too tight for words. Caleb turned to Nathaniel, who stood frozen, his face flushed. "She deserves better," Caleb said, his tone even but firm. Without another word, he guided Ellie's chair toward the exit, the wheels gliding smoothly over the polished floor. No one spoke. No one dared. The restaurant's chatter died into stunned silence as they left, the image of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect lingering behind. Outside, the Seattle air was cool, heavy, with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and distant pine. Ellie felt the knot in her chest begin to loosen, though her hands still trembled on the armrests. Caleb released her chair once they reached the sidewalk, stepping back to give her space. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with sincerity. "I didn't mean to overstep. I just couldn't watch that happen." Ellie looked up at him, taking in his stubbled jaw, the faint grease stain on his collar, the tired lines around his eyes. He was a stranger, yet he'd seen her in a way no one had in years, not as a headline, not as a tragedy, but as a person. "You don't even know me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Didn't need to." Ellie exhaled, the weight of the night pressing against her ribs. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He nodded, his smile widening just enough to show a hint of warmth. "Caleb." "Nice to meet you, Ellie." Despite the ache in her chest, a soft, surprised laugh escaped her. "Likewise." They stood there for a moment, the city humming around them, car horns, distant laughter, the steady drip of rain on a nearby awning. Ellie's heartbeat slowed, grounding her in the present. "I didn't even get to eat," she admitted, almost to herself, a wry smile breaking through. "Skipped lunch for, well, that." Caleb glanced back at the restaurant, its warm lights glowing through the rain-streaked windows. "Doesn't look like you missed much," he said. Then, after a beat, "There's a coffee shop a block away. Nothing fancy, cracked mugs, wobbly tables, but their scones are worth the walk. Or a roll." He winced slightly, as if worried he'd said the wrong thing, but Ellie's smile grew genuine this time. "Why not?" she said, surprising herself. Caleb grinned, a spark of relief in his eyes. "Let's go." They moved down the sidewalk, Caleb matching her pace without effort, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The coffee shop, a small hole in the wall called the Rainy Nook, was tucked between a bookstore and a thrift shop, its neon sign flickering in the drizzle. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans and warm pastry, and the barista greeted Caleb by name, tossing him a rag to wipe the rain from his face. Ellie maneuvered her chair to a low table near the window, the hum of conversation and the clatter of cups wrapping around her like a blanket. Caleb ordered for them 2 blueberry scones and a pair of black coffees, then sat across from her, his broad frame making the small chair look comically fragile. So he said, leaning forward, "You're a CEO. That's kind of a big deal." Ellie raised an eyebrow, bracing for the usual awe or pity, but Caleb's tone was curious, not reverent. "It's a job," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "A lot of pressure, a lot of eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I'm running the company, or it's running me. Caleb nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of his mug. I get that. I fix pipes for a living. Not exactly glamorous, but when a job goes wrong, everyone notices. Water everywhere, yelling clients, the works. He chuckled, and Ellie found herself smiling again, drawn to his ease, his lack of pretense. Ever had a pipe burst at 2 a.m., he asked. She shook her head. Lucky you, he said, grinning. It's a special kind of chaos. Ellie laughed, the sound startling her. When was the last time she'd laughed without guarding herself? They talked for an hour, the conversation flowing from small things, Seattle's endless rain, the best food trucks to deeper ones. Ellie shared how the accident had reshaped her life, how she'd fought to prove she was more than her disability, only to feel like the world only saw her chair. Caleb listened, not interrupting, not offering empty platitudes, just nodding as if he understood what it meant to carry an invisible weight. The rain had slowed to a mist when they left the shop. Ellie's cardigan was damp. Her hair slightly frizzed, but she didn't care. Caleb walked beside her, his boots splashing in shallow puddles. You okay getting home? He asked, his voice gentle but not patronizing. Ellie nodded, though part of her didn't want the night to end. I'll be fine, she said. Thanks to you. He shrugged, that same easy smile returning. Anytime. As she wheeled toward her car where her driver waited, Ellie glanced back. Caleb stood under the shop's awning, hands in his pockets, watching her go. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she was moving toward it. But as her driver helped her into the car, a shadow lingered in her mind. Nathaniel's words echoed charity case, not the Ellie Voss, and with them, the older, deeper wounds. Her mother's voice sharp and commanding, telling her at 16 that love was a distraction, that Voss women were built for empires, not weakness. Ellie stared out the window as the city blurred past the rain streaking like tears against the glass. Caleb had seen her tonight, truly seen her, but could she trust it? Could she trust anyone to stay when the world had taught her that people leave when the shine wears off? She closed her eyes, the warmth of the coffee shop still lingering in her chest, and wondered if this was a fluke, or the start of something she'd stopped believing in. The Seattle rain had softened to a fine mist by the time Ellie Voss wheeled out of her downtown penthouse a week after the disastrous blind date. The city's gray skyline shimmered under a veil of clouds, and the air carried the sharp tang of wet cedar and coffee from nearby roasters. Ellie adjusted the hood of her emerald green raincoat, her fingers brushing the sleek rims of her wheelchair as she navigated the slick sidewalk toward the rainy nook, the cozy coffee shop where Caleb Monroe had taken her after that humiliating night. They'd texted a few times since, short tentative messages about the weather or a new food truck, but nothing deep, nothing that risked the fragile thread between them. Yet when Caleb suggested meeting again, Ellie hadn't hesitated. Something about his quiet presence, his lack of judgment had lodged in her mind like a melody she couldn't shake. Now, as she approached the shop's glowing windows, her heart fluttered with a mix of anticipation and doubt. Could she trust this feeling, or was it just the afterglow of being seen for once? Inside, the rainy nook was alive with the hum of conversation, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the warm scent of fresh pastries. Caleb was already there, leaning against the counter, chatting with the barista like an old friend. His denim jacket was slung over a chair, revealing a faded flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows, a faint smudge of grease on his forearm, hinting at a morning spent under a sink. When he saw Ellie, his face lit up with a grin that made her breath catch. "You made it," he said, crossing the room to pull out a chair at a low table near the window. "Thought the rain might scare you off." Ellie raised an eyebrow, maneuvering her chair into place. "I'm a Seattleite. Rain's basically my blood type." Caleb laughed a low, warm sound that eased the tension in her shoulders. He slid into the seat across from her, setting down 2 mugs of coffee and a plate of cinnamon scones, their edges golden and crumbling. "Hope you're hungry," he said. "These are fresh from the oven." They fell into conversation easily, the kind that felt like slipping into a favorite sweater. Caleb told her about a burst pipe job that had him wading through a flooded basement at midnight, his boots still drying out in his truck. Ellie shared a story about a board meeting where she'd outmaneuvered a smug investor, her voice sharp with pride, but softening when she admitted how exhausting it was to always prove herself. "Everyone's waiting for me to fail," she said, staring into her coffee. "Like my chair makes me less of a CEO." Caleb tilted his head, his hazel eyes steady. "Sounds like they're the ones failing, not seeing who you really are." Ellie's chest tightened, not with pain, but with something unfamiliar. Hope, maybe, or the rare sensation of being understood. She wanted to say more, but her phone buzzed a sharp intrusion. A text from her mother, Margaret Voss, flashed on the screen. "Eleanor, we need to discuss your recent choices. Call me." Ellie's jaw clenched. She locked the phone and set it face down, but Caleb noticed. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone gentle, but not prying. She forced a smile. "Just family. They have opinions." Caleb nodded, letting it drop, and suggested they head to a nearby park for a free outdoor concert he'd seen advertised. "It's nothing fancy," he said, "but the music's good and the crowd's chill. You in?" Ellie hesitated. Crowds were tricky, uneven paths, curious stares, the constant fear of being in the way, but Caleb's easy confidence made her want to try. "Sure," she said, surprising herself. They left the shop, Caleb holding the door as she wheeled out into the misty air. The park was a short roll away, nestled along Puget Sound, its grassy slopes dotted with picnic blankets and string lights strung between trees. The band, a local indie group, played soft acoustic covers, their notes mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant lap of waves. Caleb pushed Ellie's chair when the path got rough, his hands steady on the handles, never making her feel like a burden. "Tell me if I'm going too fast," he said, and she laughed, the sound freer than she'd expected. "You're fine," she said. "Just don't launch me into the sound." The concert was crowded, but not overwhelming, with families and couples sprawled across the grass. Ellie felt the weight of a few curious glances, but Caleb's presence beside her was like a shield, quiet and unassuming. They found a spot near a willow tree, and Caleb spread his jacket on the ground to sit beside her. The music wrapped around them, a cover of an old Fleetwood Mac song that made Ellie's heart ache with memories of her teenage years, when she'd dreamed of playing guitar on stages like this. "I used to want to be a musician," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the melody. "Before the accident, I was pretty good too." Caleb turned to her, his expression soft. "What happened?" She shrugged her fingers, tracing the rim of her wheel. "Life. The crash, then business school, Nexus Labs, the whole CEO thing. No time for music anymore." Caleb nodded, not pushing, but his eyes held a quiet encouragement. "You ever think about picking it up again?" Ellie's throat tightened. Sometimes, she whispered, but it feels like another life. The moment was broken by a clumsy barista from a nearby coffee cart who tripped while carrying a tray of lattes. A cup tipped splashing hot coffee across Ellie's lap. She froze, heat flushing her face as the sticky liquid soaked into her jeans. The barista stammered apologies, his cheeks red, But Ellie's mind spiraled. This was the kind of moment she dreaded, the kind that drew eyes that made her chair feel like a spotlight. She braced for pity, for awkwardness, but Caleb was already moving. He pulled a clean rag from his pocket. A plumber's habit, she realized, and crouched beside her. "Hold on," he said, his voice calm as he dabbed the coffee from her jeans, his movements quick but gentle. "Good thing I'm used to spills," he said with a grin, glancing up at her. "My niece once dumped a whole smoothie on me. This is nothing." Ellie laughed, the sound shaky but real, the tension in her chest easing. Caleb didn't make a show of it, didn't linger or fuss. He just cleaned up the mess and sat back down like it was the most natural thing in the world. The concert ended with a soft ballad, and the crowd began to disperse, leaving behind crumpled napkins and empty cups. Ellie and Caleb stayed a moment longer, watching the lights reflect off the water. "Thanks for this," she said, her voice quiet. "I haven't been to something like this in years." Caleb shrugged, his smile easy. "Anytime. Seattle's got a lot of these hidden spots. Stick with me, I'll show you the good ones." Ellie's heart warmed, but her phone buzzed again, another text from her mother. "This man you're with, he's not our kind, Eleanor. Stop this before it goes too far." The words hit like a cold wave, dragging up old insecurities. Margaret Voss had always been a force, a woman who'd built the family's legacy with iron will, who'd taught Ellie that love was secondary to power. Ellie locked her phone again, her jaw tight, but Caleb's voice broke through. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Let's get you home," he said, standing. "Rain's picking up." They made their way back through the city, Caleb walking beside her, his pace unhurried. At a crosswalk, he noticed her raincoat slipping and paused to adjust it, his fingers brushing her shoulder as he tucked it back into place. The gesture was small, but it struck Ellie like lightning. No one touched her like that, not since the accident. Not with such ease, such care, without making her feel fragile. "You're good at this," she said, half joking. "What, fixing raincoats?" Caleb teased. "Nah, just being around you." Ellie's breath caught, and she looked away, afraid he'd see the flush in her cheeks. They reached her building, a sleek high-rise with a doorman who nodded as she approached. Caleb stopped at the curb, hands in his pockets. "See you around?" he asked, his tone light but hopeful. "Yeah," Ellie said, her voice softer than she meant. "I'd like that." Inside her apartment, Ellie wheeled to the window, staring out at the city's glittering lights. The night had been simple. A park, a concert, a spilled coffee. But it felt like a rebellion against the life she'd been living, one of boardrooms and expectations. She thought of Caleb, his calloused hands, his quiet laugh, the way he'd looked at her not as a CEO or a tragedy, but as Ellie. Her phone lit up again, her mother's name flashing like a warning. Ellie ignored it, but as she did, a new message came through, not from Margaret, but from an unknown number. "Caleb's not who you think. Be careful." Her stomach dropped. She stared at the words, the warmth of the evening unraveling. Who was Caleb really? And why did someone care enough to warn her? Outside, the rain fell harder, blurring the world beyond her window, and Ellie felt the first stirrings of doubt creep into her heart. But beneath it, something stronger lingered, a spark fragile but stubborn that refused to be washed away. The Seattle night was alive with the hum of Pike Place Market's after-hours bustle, strings of Edison bulbs casting a warm glow over the cobblestone streets. Ellie Voss wheeled through the crowd, her navy scarf catching the breeze as the scent of grilled seafood and fresh flowers mingled in the air. Beside her, Caleb Monroe walked with his usual easy stride, his worn flannel shirt brushing against his work-calloused hands, a faint grin tugging at his lips as he pointed out a vendor selling handmade candles. It had been 2 weeks since the concert in the park, and their meetings had become a quiet rhythm. Coffee at the rainy nook strolls along the waterfront, moments where Ellie felt herself softening, letting go of the armor she'd worn for years. Tonight, they'd come to the market for a community event, a fundraiser to repair a local youth center's plumbing system, a project Caleb had volunteered for and convinced Ellie to join. She wasn't sure why she'd agreed Nexus Labs boardrooms were her battleground, not community service, but something about Caleb's earnestness, his belief that small acts mattered, had pulled her in. Yet the cryptic text from an unknown number lingered in her mind. "Caleb's not who you think. Be careful." She hadn't told him about it, hadn't known how, but it gnawed at her, a shadow over the warmth of his presence. The market was crowded with families, artists, and food carts, the air buzzing with laughter and the sizzle of frying dumplings. Ellie maneuvered her wheelchair carefully, avoiding uneven stones, while Caleb stayed close, his hand hovering near her chair, but never touching unless she needed it. They reached the youth center's booth, a makeshift setup with flyers and a donation jar where a group of volunteers was organizing supplies. Caleb introduced Ellie to Mia, the center's director, a wiry woman with a quick smile and paint-splattered jeans. "Caleb says you're a genius with systems." Mia said, shaking Ellie's hand. "We could use someone like you to figure out how to stretch our budget." Ellie blinked, caught off guard. "I'm just here to help with the event," she said, but Mia grinned. "Sure, but I'm betting you'll have ideas by the end of the night." Caleb chuckled, nudging Ellie's shoulder. "Told you she'd rope you in." Ellie rolled her eyes but smiled, feeling a flicker of purpose she hadn't expected. They spent the evening sorting supplies and handing out flyers, Caleb diving into the work with a focus that made Ellie pause. He wasn't just fixing pipes, he was teaching a group of teens how to use a wrench, his voice patient, as he explained pressure valves and threading. Ellie watched from a nearby table, her laptop open as she sketched out a funding plan for Mia, her CEO instincts kicking in despite herself. In a quiet moment, she pulled out her sketchbook, a habit she had rediscovered since meeting Caleb, and began drawing him, his broad shoulders hunched over a pipe, his brow furrowed in concentration, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. The pencil moved almost on its own, capturing the quiet strength she'd come to associate with him. When he noticed, he wandered over, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's that?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Ellie flushed, snapping the book shut. "Nothing," she said too quickly. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. Just handed her a bottle of sparkling water. "You're good, you know," he said. "Not just at the CEO stuff. At seeing people." Ellie's throat tightened, and she looked away, the weight of his words settling deep. As the night wound down, Caleb suggested they grab food from a nearby dumpling cart. They sat at a small table under a string of lights, the crowd thinning as vendors began to pack up. Caleb ordered pork buns and veggie dumplings, passing her a paper plate with a grin. "Best in the city," he said. Ellie took a bite, the savory warmth spreading through her, and for a moment she forgot the text, the doubts, the world outside this pocket of light. But then a man approached his boots, heavy on the cobblestones, his face half hidden under a baseball cap. "Monroe," he said, his voice rough. Caleb stiffened, his smile fading. "Jake," he said, standing. "What are you doing here?" "The man." Jake glanced at Ellie, his eyes narrowing before returning to Caleb. "Heard you were playing hero again," he said, his tone laced with something bitter. "Thought you learned your lesson last time." Ellie's stomach churned, the cryptic text flashing in her mind. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Not now," he said, his voice low. Jake smirked, tossing a crumpled flyer onto the table. "Just don't drag her into your mess," he said, then walked off, disappearing into the crowd. Ellie's hands gripped her plate, her voice steady, despite the unease curling in her chest. "Who was that?" she asked. Caleb hesitated, running a hand through his dark hair. "Old friend," he said, but his eyes didn't meet hers. "From a long time ago." Ellie wanted to press, but the vulnerability in his expression stopped her. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about the youth center, and Caleb relaxed, telling her about the kids he'd met, one of whom reminded him of his niece Lila. "She's 8, he said, his voice softening. "Lives with my mom now. Her mom, my sister. She's been in and out of rehab. I stepped in when things got bad." Ellie nodded, her heart aching at the parallel to her own losses, her father's absence, her mother's cold ambition. "That must have been hard," she said. Caleb shrugged. "Hard's just life, right? You do what you gotta do." Later, they wandered to Caleb's small workshop, a cluttered garage tucked behind the market, where he kept his tools and worked on side projects. The space smelled of motor oil and sawdust, with pipes and fittings stacked against the walls. Caleb showed her a small sculpture he'd made, a bracelet woven from copper wire, its edges polished to a soft gleam. "Made it for Lila," he said then, after a pause, "but I think you should have it." He slipped it onto her wrist, his fingers brushing her skin, and Ellie's breath caught. No one had given her something so simple, so real in years. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. Caleb smiled, but there was a shadow in his eyes, like he was holding something back. The moment was shattered when Caleb's phone rang, a sharp trill cutting through the quiet. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening, and stepped outside to take the call. Ellie couldn't hear much, just fragments. "Not now? I told you, I'm done." Before he hung up and returned, his expression closed off. "Everything okay?" Ellie asked, echoing his question from the park. He nodded, but it was too quick, too forced. "Just work stuff," he said, shoving his phone into his pocket. Ellie didn't believe him, but she didn't push. They left the workshop, the night air cool and heavy with the threat of rain. As they reached her building, Caleb hesitated. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said, his voice softer now. "You made it better." Ellie smiled, but the text and Jake's words lingered like a storm cloud. "You too," she said, meaning it, but feeling the weight of unanswered questions. Back in her apartment, Ellie sat by her window, the city's lights blurred by the gathering rain. She turned the copper bracelet on her wrist, its weight grounding her. Caleb was different kind, real unafraid of her chair or her title, but the warning text and Jake's cryptic comment gnawed at her. She opened her laptop, hesitating, then typed Caleb's name into a search engine. A few articles popped up: local plumber volunteer work. Nothing unusual, but then a buried post from a community forum caught her eye. Caleb Monroe dropped out of engineering school after his sister's overdose. Took the fall for her debts. Ellie's heart sank. Debts. What kind? And why hadn't he told her? Her phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. "Ask him about Tacoma." Ellie's fingers trembled as she locked the screen. She wanted to trust Caleb, wanted to believe in the man who'd seen her when no one else had, but doubt was a familiar companion, and it whispered now louder than ever. The rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the glass, and Ellie closed her eyes, the bracelet still warm against her skin. She thought of Caleb's hands, steady and gentle, teaching teens to fix pipes, crafting gifts from scraps, shielding her from the world's cruelty. But she also thought of Jake's warning, the phone call, the secrets he hadn't shared. Was she falling for a man she barely knew, or was this just another lesson in how hope could hurt? The night stretched on, and Ellie sat in the dark, caught between the pull of her heart and the weight of her doubts, wondering if Caleb was her haven or her next heartbreak. The Seattle rain fell in a relentless curtain, turning the city into a blur of silver and shadow. Ellie Voss wheeled through the downpour, her wheelchair's tires slick against the wet pavement, her navy raincoat clinging to her shoulders. The Fremont Bridge loomed ahead, its steel arches faintly visible through the mist, a place she hadn't visited in years, not since she was a girl holding her mother's hand, dreaming of crossing it on foot. Now at 32, the CEO of Nexus Labs, she was here for answers driven by a mix of heartache and determination. Caleb Monroe had vanished 3 days ago after a cryptic phone call at his workshop, leaving only a text that cut deeper than any insult from that disastrous blind date. "I can't do this. You're better off without me." The words didn't sound like him, not the man who'd crafted her a copper bracelet, who'd pushed her chair through a crowded concert with quiet care. The warning texts. "Caleb's not who you think. Ask him about Tacoma," echoed in her mind, but so did his steady gaze, his gentle hands. Ellie refused to believe he'd walked away by choice. So here she was, in the rain, searching for him, her heart pounding with fear and hope. The streets near the bridge were quiet, the usual bustle muted by the storm. Ellie's hands trembled on the rims of her chair, the cold seeping through her gloves. She'd tried calling Caleb, texting, even stopping by his workshop, but the garage was locked, the lights off. A co-worker had mentioned he'd been seen near Fremont, working a late job, so she'd come here to the bridge that held her childhood memories and maybe, just maybe, a piece of Caleb. As she approached the bridge's pedestrian path, her breath caught a figure stood at the center, leaning against the railing, his silhouette blurred by the rain. It was him, Caleb, in his worn denim jacket, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, staring out at the churning waters of the Fremont Cut. Ellie pushed forward, the wheels catching on the wet metal, her voice sharp against the rain. "Caleb." He turned, his hazel eyes widening, a mix of surprise and pain crossing his face. "Ellie?" he said, his voice raw. "What are you doing here?" She stopped a few feet away, her chest heaving, rain dripping from her lashes. "You left?" she said, the words trembling with hurt. "You sent that text and disappeared." "Why?" Caleb's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his hands gripping the railing. "I had to," he said. "You don't understand." Ellie's hands clenched the armrests of her chair. "Then make me understand," she said, her voice rising. "Because I trusted you. I let you in and you walked away like everyone else." The words hung between them, heavy as the rain. Caleb's shoulders slumped, and he turned to face her, his eyes glassy. "It wasn't about you," he said. "It was about keeping you safe." Ellie frowned, the cryptic texts flashing in her mind. Safe from what she asked. Caleb hesitated, then stepped closer, crouching so they were eye level, the rain soaking his jacket. "Your company," he said. "Nexus Labs. Someone from your board, some suit named Victor Crane, sent people to my shop. They told me to stay away from you, said I'd ruin your reputation, drag you down. They made it clear I didn't have a choice." Ellie's breath caught her mind racing. Victor Crane, her mother's right-hand man on the board, a man who'd always seen her as a liability, not a leader. "What did they do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb's hand brushed his jaw, where a faint bruise lingered, barely visible in the dim light. "They didn't ask nicely," he said, "but it wasn't just that. They knew about my sister, about Tacoma, about the debts I took on to keep her out of jail. They said they'd drag it all up, make it public, tie it to you. I couldn't let that happen." Ellie's heart sank, the pieces falling into place. The warning texts, Jake's bitter words at the market, Caleb's sudden absence. "You lied to protect me," she said, her voice cracking. Caleb nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. "I thought if I walked away, they'd leave you alone. You're too important, Ellie. Your work, your life. It's bigger than me." Ellie shook her head, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "You think I care about that?" she said. "I've spent years building Nexus Labs, proving I'm more than this chair, but none of it means anything if I'm alone. I needed you, Caleb. Not my reputation, not my company, you." Caleb's breath hitched and he reached for her hand, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Ellie squeezed his hand, her voice firm despite the tremble. "The right thing was telling me the truth. We could have faced it together." Caleb's eyes softened, and he nodded, rain sliding down his face like tears. "You're right," he said. "I should have trusted you." The rain slowed to a drizzle, and Ellie looked out at the bridge, its arches glowing faintly under the streetlights. "This place," she said softly, "I used to come here with my mom. We'd walk across it, just the two of us, talking about everything, school music, dreams. I thought one day I'd walk it myself, no chair, no limits." She paused, her voice breaking. "After the accident, I stopped coming. It hurt too much." Caleb's hand tightened around hers. "You're here now," he said. "That's something." Ellie met his gaze, her heart swelling with a mix of pain and hope. "Help me cross it," she said the words, a quiet plea. Caleb nodded, standing to guide her chair onto the path. The bridge wasn't long, but it arched in the middle, a gentle curve that felt like a mountain. Halfway across, Ellie stopped, her hands trembling. "Wait," she said. "I want to try something." Caleb looked at her, his brow furrowing. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, her jaw set. With his help, she gripped the railings, her legs unsteady but supported by his arms. Slowly she stood, her first steps in years, each one shaky, but hers. Caleb held her steady, his hands firm at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've got this," he whispered. Ellie took 3 steps, her breath hitching as the cold metal grounded her, the river below, shimmering in the rain. Tears blurred her vision, but she laughed, a soft, broken sound. "I'm doing it," she said. Caleb smiled, his voice thick. "You are." In that moment, under the drizzle, she leaned forward and kissed him, her lips soft against his, rain and tears mingling in a quiet collision of trust and love. When they pulled apart, their foreheads pressed together, Ellie whispered, "Don't leave me again." Caleb's voice was steady. "Never." The next morning, Ellie wheeled into the Nexus Labs boardroom, her posture unyielding despite the sleepless night. The glass table reflected the city's skyline, and her mother, Margaret Voss, sat at the head, her silver hair immaculate, her eyes sharp. Victor Crane sat to her right, his smile thin and calculated. The other board members shifted uncomfortably as Ellie spoke, her voice calm, but edged with steel. "Victor," she said, "I know what you did. You threatened Caleb Monroe to keep him away from me, to protect your idea of this company's image." The room stilled, Victor's face paling. "Eleanor," he began, but she cut him off. "I built Nexus Labs," she said. "I've carried it through crises, through doubts, through my own pain. But I won't let it or you decide who I love." Margaret's eyes narrowed, but Ellie held her gaze. "I'm done living for your approval, Mom. I choose my life, my happiness. And if that means walking away from this board, I will." A heavy silence fell. Margaret's expression flickered, a crack in her iron facade. "You'd give up everything?" she asked, her voice low. Ellie's hands gripped her chair, her voice unwavering. "If it means being whole, yes." Victor shifted his voice tight. "You're making a mistake, Eleanor." But Ellie's eyes didn't waver. "The mistake was letting people like you think they could control me." She turned her chair, the wheels gliding smoothly across the polished floor, and left the room, the door closing with a soft click. Outside, Caleb waited in the lobby, his flannel shirt out of place among the glass and steel. He stood as she approached, his smile hesitant but warm. "You okay?" he asked. Ellie nodded, her chest lighter than it had been in years. "Better than okay," she said. 3 months later, the sun broke through Seattle's clouds, casting a golden glow over a small beach near Alki Point. The sand stretched out in a quiet crescent waves, lapping gently at the shore. Ellie sat in her wheelchair, a simple white dress draped over her lap, a daisy tucked into her auburn hair. Caleb stood beside her, his shirt slightly wrinkled, but his eyes bright, holding a ring he'd made himself from copper and steel. Their engagement ceremony was small, just friends, Caleb's niece Lila, scattering petals from a basket, and a few co-workers from his workshop. The youth center's director, Mia, played a soft guitar melody, the notes mingling with the breeze. Ellie's mother stood at the edge of the crowd. Her gray coat understated her presence, a quiet olive branch. She hadn't spoken to Ellie since the boardroom, but her being here was enough a step toward healing. As the ceremony ended, Caleb knelt beside Ellie, his hand finding hers. "Ready for one more thing?" he asked, his grin mischievous. She raised an eyebrow. "What now?" He guided her chair to the edge of the sand where the path met the beach. With gentle strength, he helped her stand, her legs trembling but supported by his arms. The sand was cool and soft under her bare feet, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. She took a step, then another, leaning into Caleb, her fingers gripping his shoulders. "You caught me," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "In every way." Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face, his voice soft. "And I'll be here for every step after." They stood there, the waves whispering, the sky wide and open, and Ellie felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: peace, love, and the courage to begin again.